like we have all of this talk about afterlife experiences and the other worlds that we can inhabit in the afterlife, but we still are not to the point, I feel, where we can totally talk about how certain mystics have written extensively about inhabiting other worlds in this lifetime and the ability to travel and go and basically be spiritual visitors or spiritual travelers in these other planes or worlds. And I think on the comparative level, like when you get into sites like Kepler.net, which takes all of these traditions and lines them up and says, you know, they all have this essentially the same hierarchy of worlds or hierarchy of being that a person can inhabit. And they're all virtually very, very similar, and they're just using, you know, different languages and coming from different speak about them. But it's basically the same premise that pure spirit descends, you know, in qualitative degrees to the state of matter that we're inhabiting right now, and that there are lots of different roads and pathways and levels and so on and so forth that, you know, come about from there to here. And you know, various traditions go into them more in depth, and certain ones stop at certain points. Like a lot of people only talk about the astral, which I think is only the first kind of, it's sort of the closest to this world, is you know, coming from the study that I've done on this. So yeah, I don't know, I just thought it'd be fun to see what you guys thought about that. I know Jared really likes Kepler. I don't know if you've been to Kepler.net at all, Kurt, but it's a cool place, man.
I think, Kurt, you'd probably have a lot of stuff to say on this just because of your recent videos about psychedelics and the goggles and stuff.
Yeah, I've been, I'm kind of torn because, like, talking about all this stuff is only useful for people already doing it.
Hmm.
You know, like, if you're not exploring those realms in some way or another, then it's just, it's a fun story, you know? And you're not going to convince anybody with it either unless you're, like, you know, manifesting dream worlds in front of them or something like that. You know, it's kind of, I'm really torn about, like, the place of talking on a lot of stuff. I don't know, it's fun. I'm just, you know, I've been struggling with exactly what is it actually accomplishing or doing. But I really like doing it, so I'll just do it for my entertainment. But
I think it can also become a kind of science, not science in the way that we would normally think of it, but a science, at least on the level of comparative literature, that you can take all of these seemingly isolated instances and start to compare them and look at them very carefully and look at what these men and women are experiencing from the inside in inner contemplative states, and you can start to see that it's very similar to a lot of different degrees, and they're speaking of essentially the same worlds, planes, spiritual states, however you want to call it. And
for a lot of
the
them, yeah,
level
it's blatantly obvious that they're speaking of the same thing, just with a different metaphor. But for as far as making like let's just say Castaneda stuff, for instance, on the surface level, it looks totally different from yoga's metaphysics.
right.
To me, at least, until I got into a couple of really weird experiences, and I'm like, oh crap, it's the exact same thing, but it's just worded so radically differently that I wouldn't even know where to start as far as how to verbalize how they're similar. It's just like that native reality tunnel that their mindset is in is so far different from like the Indian one, that the only way that they meet is when you get rid of their reality tunnel, so to speak, or, you know, something like that. It's just like minds operate on a radically different level that it was. So some of those systems that are like, basically the ones that are kind of together on the same continent, I think intellectually makes sense together, but the other ones, like their perception of reality is so far different, and the way that they interpret it is just like, doesn't make any sense.
Right. But I think like there's you can at least somewhat link them, you know. I mean, the farther that you get into it, and that the more intense you go into the study of it, the more similar they start to look, and not on the level of just hashing it and throwing it together and saying, look, well, this matches up here and blah blah blah, like in a systematic way, but in a way that at least gives credit to the existence of that great chain of being, or gives credit to the existence of.
I would agree, but I think
beings.
the average person in our culture that would go about it from a scientific method could prove the exact opposite with the way that the average person thinks, you know? Like, we're kind of steeped in this mindset, so you can see it. But if somebody wanted to play devil's advocate with logic and reason, they'd be like, oh, look at all these things, they're all conflicting.
Right.
You know,
but that's kind of the paradox of it. Like, that's sort of the thing that all of us have really been having trouble with, is it's not, I mean, it doesn't always match reason and logic per se. It has its own logic. And I think part of the conflict is that we're dealing with transhuman laws. Like, we're dealing with non-human laws that humans interpret or come into experience with. And each, you know, according to culture and history and whatever it is, and from their own point of view. But I would agree, and I would say that's precisely the flaw, in a sense, of the scientific method, is that it isn't able to encounter these things yet with precision. I mean, I would make that argument that it can't really necessarily, and maybe it shouldn't. Maybe that's not its. It
can't. Like, it's almost like all this. The scientific method is like looking through a microscope, and the stuff we're talking about is kind of like looking around the room with your own eyes.
Yeah.
You know, it's not. It's just. They kind of don't compute, and so I don't know how to teach somebody that, to be honest, unless you feed them psychedelics or send them to a Zen retreat. You know, I have no idea how to get an average person to hop on board with that just from me verbally spouting stuff, because it just doesn't. I've tried a lot, and I'm at this place where it's like I just feel like people are where they are, which kind of lines up with the spiral dynamic stuff, you know. You can't.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps we shouldn't. I don't think that we should come across as people that are necessarily trying to convince or being persuasive in that way per se, but we can at least, I don't know, come to conclusions based on a different scientific method, based on a sacred science, you know, with yoga or with contemplative.
Like a contemplative science?
Yeah, I mean, which I want to go back to and say that
which is yoga. I mean, it's already been done. You know, yoga is a incredibly well thought out science of all of this stuff.
But it's bringing it to the present and offering it, in a sense, to anybody who wants to come to this virtual way station, or this kind of we're attempting to create a sacred space in the virtual station. And in doing so, we want there to be that potential for people to maybe hear things that they normally wouldn't. And I think that's part of the difficulty, is like mainlining some of the depth of an advanced, entirely ancient system like yoga, which goes so far back. And I mean, in literature, I mean, there have been people who have studied it for all their life. But